A simple piece of trail with not too many features on it, we're probably all pretty happy to ride quickly. And the reason? Our brain can quickly assess what's ahead, there isn't much to deal with, and we can get on with the doing. The thinking is done quick, and there's a nice shortcut because there's not many decisions to make. The problem becomes when there's more to deal with and there's more white noise coming up from the trail, more technical features, steeper, perhaps cambered, roots, rocks, whatever it might be. We refer to those as performance cues, and if you've read our articles before, you're going to heard us refer to those performance cues in three categories. Visuals, the ones we see, input, the ones we feel, and performance cue waiting or anticipation, the ones we fear. Now, in order for my brain to work its way through how to deal with different performance cues and different technical features, I need to buy it some time. The quickest, simplest and easiest way of doing that is obviously to look further ahead and see things earlier. Easy to think about doing, much harder to do. We tend to bounce our eyes down a lot or get sucked into looking down into the trail, and that is going to happen. We recognise that as a fact. So simply telling you to look up, look up, look up probably isn't going to help, because you're just going to be blindly staring ahead rather than actually taking in and digesting the correct information. So rather than think about continually looking as far ahead, because that's not always going to happen, and beating yourself up when you look down, think about that dwell time of how often you are looking down and how long for. Try and bounce your eyes back up. Look up and through visual performance cues is really going to help. We want to know what's next and what's next and what's next. And the further ahead I'm looking, the slower things are coming at me. Our sense of time perception changes rapidly. The moment we look down, we get a ground rush, lots of information firing in, our brain becomes flustered, our body runs out of instructions because our brain hasn't really deciphered anything, and our body jumps in with an instinctual grab or dab of the brakes. And dabbing the brakes or dragging your brakes down trails is a killer when it comes to carrying speed. Pretty obvious, that one. Looking up and through is really going to help. The other thing we need to think about is how well we're separating out what we do need to look at and what we don't. And that's kind of sorting the wheat from the chaff and really identifying the things that do require our attention more and ignoring the stuff that doesn't. It's really easy to start worrying about little bits and pieces on the trail or to the side of the trail which really aren't important. Now, a lot of that comes down to pattern recognition. Vision isn't all upload, as we've discussed before in a previous article called Revision in an earlier edition. There's a lot of download. There's a lot of matching what I've experienced before to the information that's starting to come in. The more we ride and the more successfully we ride and the more time we come across particular features, the more we can anticipate or understand the likely outcomes of what's ahead and start to plan a response before we've digested all of the information. We don't necessarily need to know of every root, rock and stump on the way down here to realise that when we hit them there's a natural effect of the bike potentially stalling, and therefore thinking about what we need to do to stop that stall. If we think about the trail as a series of entry, section and exit points and break it down into sections, sometimes those sections are spread out and they're nice and long and we've got a clear entry point, a nice long section and an obvious exit. Other times, as trails become more complicated, those sections overlap and there's an entry from the entry point through the section into the exit point becomes the entry to the next. In that instance, we've got a lot more processing to do a lot quicker. So really honing in on what we do need to do and having a more instinctive response, learned instinctive response rather than a flight or fight based response is really important. But to keep it simple, bounce those eyes up and through, keep trying to think about what's next, and don't engage too much with what's just in front of your wheel. It's too late to deal with it. By the time you see it late, your body's going to respond by trying to slow things down. That flight or fight response of just grabbing the brakes. There are a school of riders out there that just point and hope and go real fast. They don't even think at all. Now that approach might work for short periods of time and short bursts of speeds, but really if we want to maintain a consistent level of high speed, we need to take a slightly more informed approach than just pointing and hope. Let's go down this trail a little bit further and have a little look at where things start to get a little bit more technical and where we need to start thinking about performance cues that are a bit more going to have a bit more of effect. No. So as we look up and through this section, if we're looking further ahead, we start to see stronger visual performance cues. The trail is more guarded at the sides, it's more of a tunnel effect, which leads me to look straight down it, which in some situations can lead to a few problems. Here it's not such an issue because it's a fairly straight trail, but the trail does have a vanishing point, which as I look down and the trail is framed, it's very easy to get sucked into that vanishing point and think no further than that. But for now, those visuals are getting stronger. The first section of the trail as I came in before, up to this entry point, is smoother and faster, and it's really easy to overshoot the entry point into the rooty section below, we're carrying too much speed. Now, if we're looking for speed, you might say, well, that's great, we're not braking as much. But speed control isn't all about braking. Speed control has three elements. We can slow down, we can speed up, and we can ease off. What we're aiming to do is, by the entry point of that section, is to have a speed from which we can accelerate all the way through the section, rather than decelerating in the section. Now that doesn't mean I'm never going to use my brakes in a section. It just means I want the bike to accelerate, so I might control my rate of acceleration because I want to keep my emotions in check. When we start to unravel and things start to come on top of us, we go from thinking through stuff to going into a flight or fight mode, a survival based mode. It's kind of a shutdown mode where all we focus on is staying alive, hanging on tight, holding our breath and gripping on tight. That breathing is a massive factor in staying nice and smooth on the bike. If we can control our breathing and set our breathing to a more normal rate, we're much more likely to stay more calm and relaxed and not have such a tight core and not bounce around so much on top of the bike. We need to stay fluid and we need to let the bike move around below us. We don't want to just be a sack of spuds bouncing around on top. The more fear kicks in, or the more the fight response kicks in, the more we tense up, the more we hold on, and actually the inputs that we can feel, that performance cue of inputs, isn't dealt with very well. Remembering that when the wheels start to bounce around on things, we really need to be soft. We need to use what we call good energy management. So when it comes to performance cues, which are input performance cues, energy management is key. How we conduct ourselves in terms of how well we stay in emotional control is going to have a massive benefit on how well we manage to stay in control of the bike and our position on the bike. Remember, the trail is continually trying to push me, and if I grab the brakes, there's a bigger push. Gravity's affecting me, momentum's affecting me. There's a lot of things trying to push me around, and I don't want to be on that's pushed. I want to do the pushing. Going back to some core engagement, heel and wrist drop means that when the wheels engage with things, when the bike tries to stall, rather than being pushed up and over, I can push down and through. When I get a push, it accelerates the bike, rather than being up on my toes and wrists where I get a push and I have to rely on my forks and my grip to keep me inside the cockpit at all, and I have to spend a lot of time recovering. Each time I get pushed and have to push back, it's a little time spike. It's taking me away from my primary goal of thinking further ahead of the bike and looking further ahead of the bike and dealing with things early. So setting your your speed at the entry point and setting your body position up at the entry point and setting your breathing up at the entry point are real key factors to think about, perhaps to concentrate on or think about as you approach the section, allowing us to accelerate through and carry that speed, which is what we want to do. Let's move on down a little bit closer and have a look at the performance cue input, which is going to certainly have a bigger effect as the ground and the terrain get more rugged and the features get bigger. That in turn might lead to a little bit of what we call performance cue weighting, where I can see that there are steps ahead and the ground is uneven, and my expectation is that something's going to happen. If I'm a competent rider and I'm an experienced rider, I'm not necessarily going to fear that and it doesn't detract me. But if I'm a little bit nervous, I start thinking too, and my thinking is more about what could go wrong than what I need to do to make it go right. And that in turn is going to lead me to want to slow down and control the situation until I've got emotional control again. If I can keep that emotional control by thinking through the section, pumping through the section where necessary for the inputs, and looking through the section to avoid the visual performance cues, everything stays a little bit calmer, and actually my speed doesn't feel as great even if it is quite a lot faster.